Hello and welcome to another edition of Nucleus Investment Insights. We have special guest David Llewellyn-Smith joining us today. We're talking all about Trump and what would happen if he gets back in terms of, we're going to run through sort of some of the odd stuff to start with. But then what we're really going to jump into is what does it mean for investors, and what are the different macro implications? What are some of the sectors that might make a difference, and and some of the things surrounding that. But we will sort of run through initially some of the court cases, some of the odds, and what you really should be watching. I think the key ones, there's obviously lots of noise going on, and we'll talk about that. And just a quick reminder, though, everything you hear here is general in nature. It's not personal financial advice. If you do want personal financial advice, you can book in with a call with us, or give us a call, and we can talk about your needs at that point in time. So without any further ado, welcome, David.
Thanks, Damo, and it's nice to be described as special.
Yes, that's right. Especially in the good way, special. Yes. There's We have our a slide up of Donald Trump on the Game of Thrones, aka Joffrey. I think is meant to be the intent behind it, but I think there's potential parallels there. But we might jump straight into some of the betting odds. So we've got the betting odds showing up as 45% chance now. So it was 25% for most of last year, and then come July-ish, it's basically been rising. And so I think in terms of you get different things coming from polls, but I guess people who are putting their money where their mouth is, not to say they're all rational, but they're putting it down as a 45% chance. I know what your thoughts are, Dave, on any of the polling stuff that we should be aware of.
Well, the polls are actually better than that. They favour Trump. But as you say, there's not a lot of skin in the game with those. But I would simply observe that at this point, at a point this far out from the election, it's very easy to flip-flop around and choose a candidate that captures your grievance of the day. So I don't think it's terribly indicative at this stage.
There's not a lot of consequence to telling a pollster that you might vote for somebody who you're not quite sure about.
No.
Yes. So I guess that probably comes back to some of the legal cases, and I guess where I'm thinking from in terms of odds. I think to me that it would seem that a criminal conviction would trump one of the, so to speak, a lot of the civil convictions. So I guess the view I'm sort of taking in terms of what are the odds that he gets in are highly dependent upon getting a whether he gets a criminal conviction, particularly in some of the more key cases, or actually more importantly, I guess, in some of the key cases. So I thought I'd run through some of the timeframes and just talk about what the issues are from that perspective. So he has lost pretty much every case so far, and it's pretty clear his legal strategy is to run out the clock, is to basically delay these things as much as possible. But the federal cases he can get put on hold. Basically, if he gets through, wins the election, he can then just appoint an attorney general that could then decide to drop the cases. Well, could is probably a too weak of a word. I think that his first question for any potential attorney general would be, will you drop the cases if I appoint you? And anyone who says no will or equivocate would self-disqualify themselves. So I think you will get an attorney general that would drop it.
I think that would be in the ad in the New York Times.
That's right. In the job description.
Yeah.
Must be willing to drop. Yeah. It doesn't work for state cases, but the two main state cases. Look, the New York state case is going to be done. I don't think there's hard to see how that could possibly not be done. and the Georgia case is probably not going to be done and might get put on hold anyway. And the question's there. And then the next question is, can he be president from jail? And I'm going to fall back on, I think we've used several times. We used it last presidency, was that, from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, a famous quote about, and we've got Life Imitating Art, where, the president's job was not to wield power, but actually to draw attention away from it. We used that quote a few times, and the next part of the quote that we didn't use was that, on that criteria, the character they're talking about was one of the most successful presidents the galaxy had ever had. He'd already spent 2 of his 10 presidential years in prison for fraud, and that he could well be convicted in some of these cases and serving his time, under house arrest, so to speak, from the White House. It's not self-disqualifying. The question is whether it's disqualifying from from the voters' point of view. I think the civil cases so far, he certainly lost a few civil cases. It hasn't seemed to have affected his popularity, and I'd probably argue he's actually using that as more evidence that the swamp is trying to fight back, and people need to fund him and to support him harder. Dave, what your thoughts are on the civil case losses, whether that's going to affect anything?
No, not really. I think the felony charges are
the key ones.
Kicker.
Yeah.
And I only say that in terms of the swing vote. Like I think every charge he's convicted on for his base makes him all the more appealing.
Yeah.
For taking on the swamp, as it were. But for the centrist voter, the swing voter, I think you're getting into some pretty nasty territory with felony convictions.
Yeah, it's a disinterested voter who isn't paying attention and sort of going, okay, he lost a few civil cases, who cares? These things happen. Maybe he's right. He seems to be pretty. He seems to be consistent in talking about how it's a conspiracy, all a conspiracy against him. But So the other big one is the 14th Amendment, which is basically a disqualification. So if you have been in an insurrection, you should be then disqualified from the ballot. And I was going to say the Denver, it's not the Denver, it's the Colorado state voted to take him off because of that. That's with the Supreme Court. I think before it had been at the Supreme Court, I think most people were pretty split on how that was going to go, whether he would be pulled off the ballot or not. It sort of seemed like a 50-50 proposition. Following the Supreme Court taking oral arguments, it looked pretty clear that they're going to leave him on. They were very much, really didn't sort of go down the line too much about whether insurrections or not. It seemed very much around, their questions were very much around, it seemed looking for ways that they could keep him on the ballot. So I think in terms of that, I'd be very surprised. I mean, that would certainly be one that, would obviously, if he gets taken off the ballot, then, then he's obviously not going to be able to be president. But that seems to be a slim hope, if that's what you're hoping for at the moment. So the 4 big court cases and where they're sort of standing at the moment. So the hush money case is the one that's going to get away. That's already scheduled for late in March. It's hard to see how that's going to. It's hard to see how he can delay that any further. I think there's he's had his shot. A lot of the other delay tactics he's using won't work on this one. It's probably a pretty quick trial, 6 weeks ish. The big issue with this one is the criminal charges are a little bit more tenuous, so it's pretty open and shut in terms of whether he did what they said he did. The question then is, does that equate to criminal charges, or is that just or is it more just like a fine? And so that's where I think this one's pretty weak, and it's probably the least damaging electorally. Or having said that, if you had said to somebody 5 years ago that a presidential candidate, or sorry, maybe 10 years ago, that a presidential candidate would be up for on a criminal trial for hush money payments to a porn star, you would have said, well, that is self-disqualifying. And probably in any other country and almost any other politician, that would be the case. But, I think even a conviction on that hush money case, it's probably unlikely to make a huge dent in his popularity, you would think. So there's that one. Then you have the Mar-a-Lago documents. So that's scheduled for May, but that's unlikely. There's already been a lot of delay in that. Look, most other people who have done similar things to what he's done have gone to jail and for a couple of years. But, the whole presidential thing seems a little bit, potentially puts a little bit more uncertainty into whether they get jail time or not. The case itself seems pretty open and shut, but there is a judge who's amenable, and some people would suggest even encouraging to Trump running out the clock. She's been reversed twice for decisions favouring Trump, but I guess what she's learnt from that is to avoid rulings, and so everything she's been doing have sort of been these paperless orders, which are much harder to reverse, and there's lots of sort of delay in the whole process. So, how long could this case go for? I think if you had a judge who was so minded, you could probably get it all done in 6 weeks and wrapped up. I think if you had a judge who was willing to take on sort of delay, then maybe 6 months. So I think there's, I think from the Trump perspective, they're basically going, there's millions and millions of documents we're talking about. We need to go through each one of these documents and dispute each one of them individually, and so drag the case out for as long as possible. And a different judge would probably go, no, it doesn't really, the fact whether they're classified or not, whether it's 1,000 documents or it's 950 documents, is a little bit beside the point. It comes down to, was there a significant amount of ones? And so again, that one though, they're quite possible. There's actually a couple of things at the moment where the judges made some rulings which could result in her getting taken off if she doesn't reverse. So that's sort of, she's already had 2 strikes. A third strike would be a reasonable chance of her getting taken off that case. So really that's the thing to watch for in that case, is that do you get a change of judge? If you don't, then they'll probably run the clock out, I would think, of that case. And the other thing is, it's probably not that damaging electorally. I mean, I think if they end up with jail time and there was sort of a lot more, I could see where a case where it would be damaging, but in terms of saying, look, state secrets, how dangerous it was and all that type of stuff. But there's also scenarios where you could see it's just like, oh, well, it was just taking papers home. Everyone does it. It was all a bit of an accident, and maybe the casual voter doesn't even notice. Dave, I don't know what your thoughts on the documents case, if that went through, whether that'd be politically damaging or not.
Look, I mean, the Republicans are doing such a great job of a sort of moral equivalence in the media, even though it's largely balderdash, that it probably doesn't hold a lot of water politically.
Yeah.
I still think the tax ruling is probably the big one.
The which one, sorry?
The tax ruling.
Oh, okay. In terms of, yeah. Well, let's do the two other big criminal ones. So the 2 election interference cases. So we've got this Georgian one. So it's a state election. So that's scheduled to start August. But even if it does start in August, this is a long case. This is a RICO case. They've got 18 defendants. It's going to run for they're not even suggesting that it'll be all done by the election. This is 6 months. Quite possibly longer. It could be 12 months. Can the case itself be delayed? Well, look, we've spent the last week or two in this sort of salacious sex scandal that's been going on. The judge, who's been pretty decent and relatively impartial, but he is running for election. He's a Republican judge. So he's probably going to at least defer to being as open to, I guess, suggestions from the defendants. There's 18 different lawyers, and so they can all ask questions and they can all delay. And maybe this improper relationship, which seems relatively trivial to most, I guess, more independent observers, but maybe that there is certainly a case that even just the appearance of something improper can be enough to get people removed, even if it's like, well, this wasn't improper, but there's an appearance of it. And that would definitely torpedo the case if they took off the main DA there. It could drop the case. Best case is going to get delayed anyway for 3 or 6 months while you got somebody new on there. So that one's, it's not going to happen before the election. That's not coming. I mean, one of the issues is it is very damaging though. He can't be pardoned, so he can't pardon himself. The state-based pardons are based on pardons for people who've been in jail for some period of time. So really, it is one where if the case starts and then he gets voted as president, are they going to keep going and then he's just going to govern from jail, or will they delay it? Will they stop it until he's not president anymore? Lots of questions, but it's probably not going to probably not going to make a huge difference unless. Except from the view, I guess, of so the one big thing with that case is it is televised. So what's been quite good for Trump, I think, in terms of, or how he's certainly used a lot of these civil ones, is he's been in the case in the court case not saying much or being chastised by judges, but then stepping out onto the steps of the courthouse and using it as a campaign stump speech, and railing about all the injustices, and that's been very beneficial for him. The one bad thing with the Georgian one is it would all be on display and it all televised, and so when you're on the stand, you can't go into those rants, and you can't. It's fine to lie on the trail, but you can't lie on the stand, and so there's sort of that could be potentially some damage, but I don't think that's really the case. The key one for me is the federal election one. So that's on hold at the moment with the Supreme Court. There's a sort of there's basically Trump has claimed that he can do whatever he wants because he was president, and he could, part of the case to the Supreme Court, to the appellate court below this, was that SEAL team, he could order SEAL Team 6 to assassinate a political rival, and unless he got impeached by the Senate and the House, then he's fine. He's allowed to do that. So it seems a relatively ridiculous argument. Supreme Court would likely smash it down. It did get smashed down by the prior every prior court. The key thing is, though, it's the what the Supreme Court does is critical to this case. So they've got three different choices. One is they could just decide not to take it at all, and then the prior one would go, and then the case is off and running, and this case would be done before before the election, and quite likely, pretty reasonable chance given all the prior cases that he gets found guilty. So that's number one. The second thing is they could take on the case but not delay it. So they could just say, yes, we're going to take it on, but the case can keep going. We'll do our stuff in the background, and the case can keep going. And so that, again, is not going to delay the case. The real key thing they could do, though, is they could take it on as a case, and that could take a couple of months. So basically, this case itself is probably going to take 3 or 4 months to go. So it's the most damaging. It's a federal case. It's conspiracy to defraud the US. All of the January 6 people are getting jail sentences. It's pretty hard to come up with a reason why he wouldn't get a jail sentence for it. It's definitely the most damaging in terms of the swing voters. But if you're the prosecution, if you get it to the Supreme Court for them to go through this ruling, they take a couple of months. The best case then is maybe a sort of late May. Oh, sorry. This is for the prosecution is the Supreme Court doesn't take it on. Sorry, that means you can get a late May, early June trial start, and then you're all done by September. Guilty and jail time, and maybe there's appeals and stuff, but he's found guilty and on the way to jail, ex the appeals. For Trump, the best case is the Supreme Court could delay this until June themselves, just in terms of getting an answer back. Then the trial itself couldn't start until October, November. Then there's questions about whether they would even start a trial, given that's right in the middle of the whole election. So, if the Supreme Court decides to take it on and delay what's called stay the proceedings, which and this decision's coming out any minute, then that is the sort of key focus on this whole. That's the key thing to watch for. So that's that's the most damaging. That gets up, then you got the question about what's going to happen. So anyway, so that's the sort of the summary of the elections. We might go to a quick message.
I guess that's why John Oliver's trying to raise $1 million to get Clarence Thomas to resign.
Yes, that was a Well, it's an interesting look at the whole. I won't go too deep into that, but I think the summary version of that is that Clarence Thomas has been taking a lot of. First of all, a number of years ago, he sort of went relatively publicly to talk about how justices aren't paid what they should be paid, and maybe he should just step down off the court. And in response, he found a number of quite wealthy friends who seemed to like to give him gifts and loans and take him on holidays that others might consider to be not above board.
I mean, he's a super conservative guy.
Yeah. So he'll definitely. So the Supreme Court, you're probably going to get 2 or 3 votes in one direction. You're definitely getting 2 or 3 votes in one direction. You're definitely getting 2 or 3 votes in the other direction. Who knows where they end up? The more centralist people. And look, it's definitely a conservative facing jury. So it's facing court. Sorry. So yeah, it is. It's. I would say the odds are 50-50. Basically, I'm looking at you can read a bunch of people who say, oh no, there's you pick your sides, but I think this one. I think the chance of him getting convicted is extremely high if it goes ahead, but I do think the Supreme Court decision is a 50-50 as to whether they delay the whole proceedings or not.
I mean, I would only add that I think the New York conviction on tax is not meaningless.
Well, I think every conviction that comes makes a difference, I think.
It does,
yeah.
But it's a big number, the fine, and he and his sons are banned from doing business, and so once again, swing voters, who are intrinsically distrusting, are going to see this as sort of gangsterism, and so I think that is a material blow. Even if we don't get these other cases there, I think there has been some damage done by the lawfare.
Yes, yeah, and there's a. I was going to put up the quote. Actually, I didn't actually have time to do it before this morning. But there's a good quote from one of his lawyers in the E. Jean Carroll the defamation case, where she's asked on a podcast whether she'd whether it's better to be smart or pretty, and she came back and said, "Oh no, I take pretty every time. You can fake being smart." And then and it's a good microcosm for the whole Trump campaign. But I think then the decision of whatever it was, $80 million, against them probably shows that, well, maybe you can't fake being smart. Maybe you can fake being smart in the court of public opinion, but it's much harder in court
not in the actual court
to fake being smart. Yes.
I mean, it's a lot of money.
Yes.
Yeah,
and each one of them does make a difference. But anyway, let's go to a quick message, and we'll come back with some more of the investment implications.
We'll be back with the investment insights very shortly. Nucleus Wealth is an active and passive investment manager. If you like what you're hearing and want some help with your investing, we can do it for you via our active portfolios. Our tactical and core portfolios use the insights shared in this podcast to construct and manage your investment. We blend tactical portfolios to offer our combinations of international shares, Australian shares, government bonds, and cash. We vary the asset allocation with the goal of protecting your capital in times of market uncertainty. We also have active international and Australian share portfolios. These are chosen using our quality and value investment philosophy. You can find out more at nucleuswealth.com. Now back to the show.
Okay.
Actually, sorry, before we get into the investment side, I probably just should quickly note, what the election issues really are going to be. So, abortion's a big one, and mostly because there's not mostly, but just to sort of add one more factor to this, that's been a big factor in most of the recent races that have been happening, And just this morning, we had a ruling from the Alabama Supreme Court that somebody who basically dropped some IVF frozen embryos that have been fertilized is now I can't remember the exact word for it, but it's basically up for manslaughter. Effectively, is about saying you've killed a child because you drop these things, and that's sort of throwing. There's just, I guess, one more example of the unintended consequences of some of the abortion laws, and that's going to be a pretty front and center in a lot of states for things like that. And there's been a number of people with quite serious medical issues who are now starting to run through that problem where there's quite serious medical issues. They're going to courts to try and get abortions and can't get them, and that I think is going to be highly damaging and a big election issue. On the flip side, border security is also going to be one, and whether there's I think from the Republicans said they wanted border security, they pretty much got what they wanted, and then they decided actually no, they didn't want that because then they can't run with it at the election. So relatively cynical, but this is what elections are about. There's the age side for both of them, both candidates, but that probably plays more against Biden than Trump. Although I think in the absence of Biden, it would certainly be a big negative on Trump.
It's certainly developing as a problem for Biden.
It is, yeah. So his press conference so for anyone who's not watching, the one of the reports into him about his documents, came back relatively scathing about his mental capacity, or certainly threw in a few lines about his mental capacity, to which he threw a press conference to show that he was mentally fit and probably set himself further back than forward. So there is questions about whether he's being hidden away by his minders and all that type of stuff like that. So it's definitely the case there, and we'll jump on into a minute about replacements. There's the whole corruption and fitness. So the Republicans have done a pretty good job, I would have thought, of running a pretty convincing campaign against the Bidens for corruption, when quite from a more centralist person might think that the corruption cases against Trump are far stronger. But and it'll be interesting to see whether that breaks down. Their key witness came out in the last couple of days and has been clearly. He's now being the key witness into the corruption is being prosecuted for lying, and it's the government's basically saying he's a Russian agent, and so it looks like the whole Republican Party's not the whole case, but a large part of the case was based upon Russian disinformation, which you would think would be self-disqualifying, but it looks like the initial signs are that the Republicans going to brazen it out, and so And I think that's probably where it comes down to, in the end, they're trying to get to a none of the above situation where effectively, people are looking at this going, there's so much corruption allegations on either side, whether they're right or wrong, that, and the problems about age and all this stuff like that whether you can just scare away a lot of voters from voting, from just going, well, no one looks good, so I'm just not even going to vote. And I think that probably plays into Trump's hands in terms of saying he's probably got the more rabid voters. And so, I think that's probably what they're looking at. I think the messier the election is, I think, and the more that people get into that none of the above, is probably better for Trump rather than for Biden. No, Dave, any other thoughts on election issues that might rear its head?
No, well, I mean, there's China there, which is probably going to play a little for Trump, given his declaration of large tariffs. And that's not to say that Biden has been anything other than hard on China, and probably, in fact, he's probably been harder on China than Trump ever was. And part of the sustained strength of the US economy, a big part of it, has been the various fiscal packages he put through that crowded in manufacturing investment. So supply chains coming out of China and going back into the US. And so, I mean, if they've got someone to prosecute the arguments, that should be fine. But Trump is sort of playing with a nuclear option on China with this 60%, wall-to-wall tariff.
Yeah.
Which and Biden, meanwhile, is kind of behind the scenes engaged in something of a détente with China. So,
but yeah, maybe it ends up being a one-upmanship once you get a bit closer to the election.
Probably. I mean, Biden has certainly been tough enough on China that they could roll out the stuff they've done and see that off. I would think, yes.
Yeah. Now, the question a lot of people ask is replacements. So, what's the process and all that? There's lots of different ways you can look at this. I think the really quick version of it, though, is that it's likely from Biden's perspective, he does want to go through, even if he was thinking about quitting and handing the reins over to somebody else, that he would actually see the process out through to getting the delegates. And then when they go to the convention to actually vote, is that at that point he would then bless his or anoint his successor and with a view that his delegates would then mostly vote for that person and through you'd go. There's a bunch of different names that could be. It's pretty uncertain. I would guess probably. Well, sorry, the polling stuff would say Gavin Newsom's probably the most likely if he decided to step back, which is he's the governor for California. Kamala Harris, the VP, doesn't seem to be a
non-starter there.
Yeah, doesn't seem to be a popular one. Michelle Obama gets a bit of note from she's probably one of the higher ones. It's very unclear as to whether she's even interested, but it's a complete left field. And then there's a bunch of other people who are sort of further back and potentially could come from somewhere. So and that might be that could be that could flip Trump away from it. And then and then on the Republican side is Nikki Haley, still in the contest and probably going to hang around with the view that, well, if he gets convicted, then maybe she'll end up being the person there. And you would think that if either one of them flipped candidates, that probably puts that party into the front, into the lead for from an expectation of whether they're going to get through. I think both candidates seem to be pretty poorly thought of. It's sort of a question of who do you like the least, Yeah,
well, a Haley Newsom election would be very difficult to call.
Yes.
I'd be tempted to go with the Republicans on that.
So we'll go to one more message and then we'll jump back into the investment implications.
We'll be back again shortly. If you like what you're hearing but want a low-cost passive option, Nucleus Wealth is the first to offer passive direct indexing in Australia. The first generation of passive investing was index funds. The next gen was ETFs. Now direct indexing is here with significantly more customization and control. The benefit of direct indexing is you can add or subtract investment themes, and we have almost 100 different options to choose from. For example, you could buy an international share direct index portfolio that excludes fossil fuels and arms manufacturers and has a tilt towards cybersecurity and cloud computing. Alternatively, you could buy a portfolio with no screens and an extra exposure to nuclear power and defense contractors. You can find out more at nucleuswealth.com. Now back to the show.
Right, so on to the macro implications first, and then we'll talk about some of the sectors. I think the key thing, though, I guess a lot of this depends upon is what is the control side. So, at the moment we've got this split House and split Senate, and that's quite potentially where we'd end up as well at the end of it. I mean, I think given based on polls, you have a little bit to Trump, a little bit to Biden. I think there's, I think if you did it's highly likely that Trump would lose, even if he does win, that he would lose the popular vote again. And so, the question would be, would they gain back control of the Senate or would they potentially even lose the control of the House, but Trump get in? And that's highly possible as well. So, in terms of the split, there's obviously going to limit a lot about what he can do, but there's this, So some of these will depend upon whether he gets sort of picks up both or not. So but yeah, let's lead across. I might throw across to you first, Dave, for some of your thoughts on what are the what are some of the key things that might be key macro implications?
So if El Trumpo does get in, which I think betting markets have got it about right at the moment, that he's sort of 45% odds. So it's not the base case, but it's very high risk case. But the obvious conclusion to draw is that he's quite inflationary, with more tax cuts to stimulate growth, and this wall-to-wall 60% tariff on Chinese goods, which adds immediate prices to everything, and especially at the low end, where you're dealing with Walmart, which is run almost entirely on Chinese goods, and so you potentially see quite an uplift in inflation if he gets in relatively quickly. But it is, and there is a second dimension to that inflationary pop, which is the border issue. If the administration does follow through on prosecuting a stronger border with Mexico and preventing the entrant of illegal workers, wall or not, then the US still has a relatively tight labour market. It's clearly balancing over time, but in part that's because so many millions of Mexican workers have returned to the US to fill its post-COVID labour gap, because they had so many retirements. And so if Trump were to go hard on the border, and that has multiple dimensions in itself, like you can shut the border, but you can also export a lot of current illegal workers. And so potentially that's quite inflationary for wages.
The question I guess I've got on that though as well is, will he just sort of pull a John Howard trick, which is the bait and switch?
And that's the big if. That's why I characterise as an if, because there are a lot of business interests that may be interested in Trump for tax cuts.
And sorry, I should define that for people just to make sure that we understand what we're talking about. So that's the idea that you build your wall, and you prosecute a bunch of people, and you separate some kids from their parents, and do some nasty things to sort of make it seem like you're doing lots, but then you turn around and let people through.
Then you fly everybody over it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So I think that's quite a likely outcome. These people, are pretty populist and unscrupulous. So, but at least on face value, these things are inflationary. There is a secondary issue here with the Mexican border, which is the Chinese economy is sinking, and there is no sign that it's going to stop sinking. And when I say sinking, it's well disguised by some GDP manipulation, and they'll meet their targets and what have you. But the fact of the matter is they've got massive oversupply in all sorts of critical sectors, and they're building more. In particular, I'm talking about the property bust, and which is weighing on demand, whilst they build yet more property and yet more manufacturing to service a consumption base that is shrinking, because so much of its wealth is contracting in property. And their only way out, as long as they sustain the current policy settings, is to export the crap out of their oversupply. Now, at the moment, they're doing a lot of this via Mexico into America. So if you look at a chart where between these three powers, Mexico, US, and China, Chinese exports into the US have collapsed at a phenomenal pace, and Mexican exports into the US have risen at a phenomenal pace. And so
the Mexican imports from China have risen.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And so there's all sorts of weirdness going on in there, where they're getting around the various tariffs and rules and things like that. So that is an extra complication in the Mexican border issue, which would be difficult to resolve. And so, but it may mitigate against an inflation pop coming out of tariffs if all it ends up doing is diverting, the supply chain of trade rather than actually changing it.
Yeah, you make everything in China still. You ship it to Mexico where they slap a sticker on it and some paint, and now it's Mexican good.
Mexico, and that's right, and off it goes. But that said, I mean, some of the policies are quite severe, and certainly the Biden administration, I think, has done a very good job on repatriating supply chains in a number of its large fiscal packages. I don't think that the Trump administration has the same intellectual heft, and so would probably kill that just out of spite and do some stupid shit, which would mean diversion to Mexico instead. So it'd probably be more positive on China than the 60% tariff suggests. Whereas Biden's actually quite, the Democrats at least have actually been quite smart in their fiscal incentives. So broadening the canvas, if you like, Europe is a real concern if Trump gets in. Some of his comments, look, I know Europe is used to this, but some of his comments on Europe and NATO have been downright terrifying. These recent comments about not exactly encouraging Putin to take over European countries if they're not prepared to pay for the NATO protection.
Yes.
It wasn't quite that, but that was the direct implication. And I mean, that's really, that's hysterical statements, really. And diplomacy is a business of radical understatement and quiet movements under the surface. And when you start making declarations of that nature, it's going to upset a lot of people. It's going to upset a lot of relationships, and so that, I think, is a real concern. Obviously, Trump's determined to withdraw from Ukrainian support. That's an additional severe blow to NATO and Europe. And so if he were to follow through on that stuff, and he may not, it may just be a simple case of Europe having to cough up, $1 billion here or there, or, start playing more golf or directing more
build more Trump towers.
European Union people to stay in Trump hotels. That might be enough just to placate Trump and keep NATO intact. But if he does disable NATO in some way, then that raises the prospect of Russian advancements into Ukraine, right into the European sphere of influence, and Europe responding with an arms race, which would include nuclear, because they could no longer trust the American Europe nuclear umbrella, and so that all gets really, really that we just hope doesn't happen.
Yeah. So I mean, so I guess that the broad brush is that Putin hasn't covered himself in glory in the Ukraine and shown that there's some military juggernaut that's going to roll right through Europe. But it's more that, if he gets to Ukraine, it's probably going to be long and bloody still and going to cost him a lot, but much more likely if Ukraine's not getting weapons from the US. But the flip side then is Europe needs to turn around and go, the rest of Europe goes, right, well, we need to be prepared for Putin to catch his breath before he does try for something else. And we can't trust the US, and so you end up with this arms race of...
That's right. And not that I think Putin would move further. He probably wouldn't. Like, if he managed to recapture, let's just call it, without being specific, the lion's share of Ukraine, he'd probably feel he has a sufficient buffer zone not to push it further. But
well, there's probably a few, but there might be some Belarus or Romania or something like that.
Look, there are a few things that might get tempting, but I don't know. That's another altogether more dramatic step. And so, but it's certainly the case that Europe would have to prepare for that prospect, and so that's an arms race in Europe, which you never want to see every time we've seen one of those, it's ended really, really badly for all of humanity.
Yeah. Well, and the flip side of it as well, though, is that just from a purely investment and economic stance, is that when it's good for some companies involved when somebody says, yes, I need to increase I'm going to spend another 1% of GDP on buying weapons, but there's not a lot of benefit for society in terms of that, and other you're taking away from you're basically taxing people more or borrowing more in order to do that. So,
Well, and for that reason, it tends to be deflationary. You're not, inflationary. You're not getting efficient allocation of resources. You're getting state forced crowding of capital into weapons over other more useful uses, and so that can be quite inflationary. So I mean, we just hope that doesn't happen. I hope NATO holds together. I mean, further deterioration in Chinese relationships. I mean, I think that's a given probably, but as we've discussed, that could be worse on the surface than it is underneath. I think it would if the Dems are kept in power. It's really interesting. I think diplomatically things would be better with China, but economically they'd be far worse for China. And it'll be the reverse under Trump, where you'd have very fractious diplomatic relations, but they might actually be better off economically.
Well, and as well, maybe it's possible that China's learnt from last time, and they need to spend more at Trump hotels this time.
They certainly spent plenty last time.
Yeah.
We might have to just double and triple.
Yeah. That's right. I sort of feel they are morally flexible enough to decide that. Whereas Europe's like, okay, no, we're not going to bribe Trump to get better relationships with him. We'll do this above board. Whereas China, you would think, would be more than happy to say, well, if it's going to cost me a few $1 billion in order to save my economy hundreds of billions, that's a good investment.
And I mean, that's a good jumping off point for the next implication, which is, Trump's been very open about his desire for revenge upon the swamp, as it were. Not that I'm saying the swamp doesn't exist, but and so he will appoint all sorts of nutbags to every keep it position, and then you'll have pushback from Capitol Hill, and so goodness only knows where that would end up. I mean, you'll have a bunch of fruitcakes running really key US strategic, economic, domestic positions, trying to do wacky stuff, and then you'll have pushback from courts and
well, and
depending on what the mix in the House and Senate is, like all sorts of deadlock.
Yes,
that could be really chaotic and probably will be.
And I think as well the quality of the people, or sorry, the competent. Let's say the experience of the people who would be in his administration would be far less than what it was last time around, given what's happened to most of the competent people who were in his prior administration. And so you're going to end up with a lot more like his lawyer, who would far rather be pretty than smart. And I think he will pick people who, based on how well they come across on TV, and last time his economic advisor was effectively a TV personality. And I think you'll get a lot more of those who will sound really good on Fox News or whatever it is about what their talking points are, but probably won't be able to put together the legal basis, and we'll just end up doing stuff because that's what it sounded good and I thought we could because we're in charge, and end up being challenged a lot in courts over that. So
because Trump.
Yes, and that goes one or two ways. Is that you end up with a complete breakdown of American society where he calls the military in to overrule the courts, or you just end up with a deadlock, and they keep trying to do stuff and then keep getting stymied by the courts, which was a fair chunk of his prior administration was filled with a lot of that. Was Trump unilaterally saying this is what he's doing and then being stopped by the courts and having to rewind. Who knows?
Yes, well, I suppose the rather unfortunate endpoint of all that is some form of civil conflict. I don't want to call it civil war. I don't know if we're there yet, but certainly some internecine U.S. conflict that is very distracting in terms of its role in the world. So
Yep.
that could be quite destabilizing for everybody if we get there. Energy prices probably lower on remove
Drill, baby, drill.
drill, baby, drill.
Yeah.
Take the domestic reservation off
Well,
LNG.
and the other thing is, I mean, the thing that is interesting for me, especially when you look at these, so this LNG reservation stuff that Biden's been talking about, that's smoke. There's nothing behind that. That's they're already doubling their capacity and more over the next few years. Like that's talking about something.
Well, it doesn't even. Well, I mean, it's not entirely smoke. Like they're not going to assess new applications for the time being.
But they're the
but
largest.
They're locked into massive expansion for the next 6 years.
That's right. Because they're already the largest. They're the largest
but the thing
exporter.
Is, the lead time on that. But the lead time on these projects is that long.
Yeah.
So I mean, by the way, I should say I completely agree with the policy.
Right.
I mean, like what if you take one glance at the Australian East Coast, then you would never just give open slather to LNG exports ever again to anywhere. Yeah. And the US has actually been very liberal in the volume of LNG exports that they've enabled. So that looks like a very sensible decision to me. But you're right, it's lightweight and be easily.
And then the ban he's got on federal lands. Most of the drilling doesn't get done on federal lands.
No, it's a very minor slice. I think it's 8% or something. It's not a lot.
This is like this is all for show. This is like, look at my green credentials. Check out this. I've banned this and I've banned that. And the flip side is it hasn't changed hardly anything. And so Trump will reverse it. But again,
as we have said repeatedly for weeks, is in these things that are apparently very, very green, very large policies, which if you look under the bonnet are really just national interest policies with a little bit of greenwashing.
Painted green, yes, exactly.
Painted green. So.
Yeah. Where I think the energy price is probably lower is probably more that Russia's probably going to be allowed to do a bit more with its oil.
Yes.
Yeah, so maybe not with Europe, but whatever it is amongst the US sphere of influence or whatever. So, what's that, sorry?
Why would that be?
Yeah, that's right. So, so while it might sound good for it to say, oh, look, this will be great for energy companies. I'm not as sure it's actually great for energy companies. Yeah, you might be able to do a bit more drilling and everything, but if oil prices are $10 lower, then the net effect of you being able to drill, even 10 or 20% more versus $10 lower oil prices, you don't want that. You'd prefer to have higher energy prices and have less. So
Yeah, and then renewables, I think we're way past the tipping point for the economics there. That it probably doesn't matter.
Yeah, that's right. I think
we actually have intensifying competition now, thanks to the Biden administration, between China and US production of green energy, and so that's only going to get more deflationary.
Yeah, China's not going to let up. Like if the US said, oh, that's it, we're going to remove all these subsidies and we're going to start taxing people, taxing batteries and solar panels for whatever reason. Okay, it's going to delay the US and slow them down, but China's going full tilt. They'll just use that as an opportunity to get, go from 90% market share to 95% market share. And you'd think that, and Europe will go harder, and so renewables. Yeah, it's not. You're not putting that genie back in the bottle. Yeah.
Australia's long mooted energy superpowerdom, has pretty much been squashed by two energy superpowers.
Yeah. Well, and Australia's a great example, though, of where we had a number of Liberal governments who were very, basically as anti as you can be in a liberal democracy against renewable power, and sort of favourable towards fossil power interests, and we're the world's largest supplier of solar power to the grid. Australia's penetration rates of solar are above all these other countries in the meantime. So right through that whole period where we had a government, more opposed than most other governments to this thing, Australia leapt to the front, and I think that's the case within. And I guess what I'm saying is I think that's where the rest of the world's getting to now. Anyway, is that Australia's got better solar resources, and so we're further in front. But
I think the lesson there is that carbon prices work.
Well, on economics,
we didn't have a public carbon price, but as you say, a sequence of Liberal governments was so easy on fossil fuel producers that they profiteered and created a private carbon tax, so that the entire household sector said, "Fuck you, we're going off grid."
So what David's saying by that is basically we let these guys, rather than having, if we had $2 and $3 per gigajoule prices for gas like we did before we opened up to global competition, or like they have in the US, that the incentive to go to solar and all these renewables wouldn't have been there. But we basically let the gas companies pump their prices up to $10-12 plus, which
70.
meant then that 70 in the Ukraine war, which then means all of a sudden all this renewable stuff it's like a carbon tax, exactly like a carbon tax, except you rather than paying it to the government, you're just paying it to private companies.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes.
And so everyone went off grid, and still is, including me.
Yes. Defence contractors. Sorry,
we're
let's talk about some sector implications. So renewables, we think it probably doesn't really matter that.
No, I don't think that matters much. In fact, profitability and margins are probably an issue, but in terms of rollout, I don't think we've got a problem.
Yeah. Well, it'll slow things down, but it's not going to make that much
volumes will be fine. I'm not sure it'll even slow it down. You're just going to have China and the US going at each other's throats. So it's going to get cheaper.
Yeah.
So labour shortages, we've discussed that on whether there'd be a bait and switch. Defence contractors.
So European sales are going to rocket.
Yeah.
Your US sales? Don't know. What is?
Well, is it the same thing?
Yeah.
But
then the thing is, does not the thing is, I would guess that most European ones are going to buy from as many European sources as they possibly can.
Well, yes.
Anyway,
and even national sources,
and then defer to say even South Korean or Japanese suppliers a lot more before the preference those versus the US. If you're in this sort of detente over the whole.
And they do have strong defence industries, despite being very weak, having very weak militaries. Not all weak militaries. Like France has a very strong navy. British a little bit as well. So there is some legacy stuff there from the imperial area that could be ramped up relatively quickly.
Yeah, but so I guess where I'm getting to is European defence contractors get a tick, US ones get a question mark. They'll be strong in Europe. They'll definitely get sales in Europe and increase that. Will there be a decrease in US military spending? I wouldn't think so, but maybe. Hard to tell.
The consumer, gosh, under Trump. Yeah, that's a very contingent one, hard to forecast. Based on how real his policies are. Like if they're legit and he's got power in the House and Senate, and he, really does hammer the Mexican border, then, you're going to have both wages and import goods pressures, but also repatriation, supply chain pressures that might not be bad for the consumer. But that's a very contingent one on how the election shakes out. You got anything on that, Damien?
Yeah, consumer. I'm a little bit. I was hoping to leave that for you. I'm going to go to healthcare. Healthcare is the next one. I haven't heard much from them about healthcare. I mean, last time they were all about we're repealing Obamacare and all that type of stuff. And then they got there and they realized actually we don't have anything better, so we basically kept it. So, I mean, I think they'll probably be slightly easier on the healthcare companies than the Bidens. So there's sort of like a positive from that perspective from the healthcare sector. But I think they're probably going to avoid, given how much of a debacle it was last time, I think they probably avoid making too many promises in the healthcare sector and really just let that skate through. I would have thought. I don't know. Have you heard anything on that? Healthcare?
No, nothing much to add other than that, if they're all nuts running stuff, then anything's possible. But nothing.
Well, that's a broader overview for everything, isn't it? Is that you've got no idea what's going to come, a brain fart somewhere.
No, there's a sovereign risk that comes with Trump, I guess is what we're saying, where you don't know.
And a sector risk in the
East.
They decide suddenly they're going to target healthcare because
sovereign risk that you can open a hole on the umbrella anywhere and the rain comes in. I just wanted to make the point that during the last Trump administration, when he applied, you may recall he initially recruited Gary from Goldman to undertake his. Sorry?
Gensler?
No, it was Gary. What's his name? Can't remember. Who engineered his corporate tax cut, but subsequently resigned in horror when Trump pivoted to China tariffs.
Oh, right. Yeah.
And the China tariff push by Trump was very negative for the stock market in the last cycle. And in the end, he capitulated because Trump sort of sees the stock market as some measure of political competence. And so the stock market forced him back to the table with China to renegotiate his tariffs. And so it's possible that something like that would happen again. That said, we've got such a pace of capital moving out of China now and into the US that it might actually not even be an issue. That might just accelerate and, fuck China. might be market's conclusion, but I'm just saying that the last time the stock market did actually manage to contain some of the more outlandish Trump pushes against China. At this stage, I'm still quite bullish on bonds. I think that the disinflation pulse in DMs is still underway in goods and increasingly in services, especially in Australia. Maybe that's colouring me on the rest of the world, but I think there's still a lot of embedded disinflation in the US housing market. And so I'm quite bullish on bonds. But if Trump were to win and he were to deliver, literally on his prospective policies, then that would definitely, put bonds into the balance.
And keeping in mind that Aussie bonds, the long end of bonds, gets priced largely off what's happening in the US, more so than what's happening in Australia.
Because Trump is so inflationary in his declarations. Now, whether that plays out, as we've discussed many times today, is the critical question. That said, now we've got AI is just this crazy thing going at the moment that's behind the stocks and to some extent business investment increasingly, etc. And it's if AI if they can iron out the problems with AI and roll it out in the way that Nvidia, for instance, last night talked about, where we've reached a tipping point where everybody wants into AI, according to Nvidia, and its profits would suggest it's not lying.
And we've got a question as well about that from Jude. He wants our take on the Nvidia results, which we'll talk about in a minute.
Sure. Then a dramatic AI rollout that worked relatively efficiently would work obviously against any Trump inflation, labor shortages, etc., coming from closing the border, and you could actually have Trump stimulus combined with deflationary AI to give yourself like a pretty kick-ass boom. That said, flip it over, and like I've been playing around with AI, and it's well, it's not woke, but it's fairly progressive in its interpretation of stuff.
Well, and whether you say it's not woke, I mean, it is being there's clearly examples that I've seen where they're basically going, well, you put in this and you got this answer that was clearly not a woke answer, and so we need to program it so it doesn't give that answer. So, and I guess you start with the whole Nazism bit about, okay, I put this in and all of a sudden I got back tenets on why I should become a Nazi. And then you're like, well, no, we can't have that. So we need to take that out. And it's not that far of a step to go, well, okay, well, therefore you can't be racist, and therefore you can't be negative about transgender. And you take the next level gays, and you take step. And so...
look, a lot of this is anecdata and it's apocryphal. So it's well, let's not say entirely worthless, but it's marginal.
Yeah.
But my sense, like, we work with Google every day at Macro Business, and I would say, I can say with some authority that working with the Google algos, there is a progressive value system at work behind Google. Right? Now, I used Gemini today on some images and just as an experiment and things, and like the base value system that was clearly woke. So I asked for 18th century images of Australian settlers, and I got an Indigenous guy who's clearly not a settler. He'd been settled, in fact. I got a weird looking like wrestler dude who was kind of like a mock Australiana. I got a picture of an American slave cotton picking woman and a Chinese lady, and Chinese weren't in Australia in the 18th century. So I mean, that's just one example, obviously, out of trillions, where the base values, I think, are progressive in these things, and they're going to work themselves out as these databases grow and get bigger and what have you. And the only point I want to make here is that there's a risk case in which Trump decides that AI is woke or progressive and against him. And so you might see antitrust shit come in under a Trump administration against AI.
But also as well, like his base is, is like it's your... who are the guys who are breaking machines again? What's the Luddites? Yeah, the Luddites who are out breaking machines. And, his base would probably welcome a little bit of Ludditeness of, like, let's throw some sand in the gears and let's slow this stuff down, and it's going to, they took my job.
Yeah.
So, that AI just, replaced me at the wherever.
Yeah,
so
yeah. We don't know. That one's up in the air, but I mean, it's not that difficult to see Trump attacking Silicon Valley over AI.
Yes.
And finally, in Forex, like if we take the Trump policies at face value, they're clearly strong dollar policies, but of course, he's all about a weak dollar. So he'll be talking down the dollar whilst everything he does drives it up. How that plays out, I guess, in the end, is about whether his policies are actually delivered, or whether they're declaratory rather than legit.
Yes, well, and that's probably, we're getting pretty close to the end, but that's probably a pretty good place to end it, though, isn't it? Is that this whole thing comes down to how much of this is genuine policy that's going to change economic situation, and how much of it is really just grist for the daily Twitter mill and the daily, whatever it is to keep running the news cycle and run this as a reality TV show that's with the whole world as an audience.
Yeah, he does need some more outrage. I mean, it's pretty benign stuff versus his first run.
Yeah, well, he's raised the bar though, so far that it's said, like, now
there's
a criminal case about fraudulent payments, hiding payments to porn stars to hush up sex acts. Like, that's, and it's like, well, and we said at the start, it probably won't affect things too much. Whereas, you know, it seems tell that to David from 10 years ago, and
but I guess that's the point, isn't it? Like, there's no free media coverage in that anymore. That's just like, okay, if you like hookers and you know, the seamy side of life, well, that's all good.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't, well, you're not going to go there. But it's like this may be a dated way of thinking about it, but I guess I'm just saying, well, really, Trump got in last time, you know, riding a wave of outrage that was, you know, largely free and delivered by the mainstream press.
Yeah, but he's got 4 court cases on that'll do the same thing.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
How can you vote for this person? He's a convicted criminal. Don't tell me what to do. I'll vote for who I want to vote for, you know?
So, well, let me ask you, Damo, just to conclude there.
Yeah.
Do you think he gets in?
No, I think the 45's too high. I would say, because if you said you're 50, I think 50-50 whether this, I think it's 50-50 whether the court case goes through, this main federal one goes through, and so in time, and so that on its own, I think that will be enough, I think, to disqualify him, because if that gets done and before people are even voting, and before that, you know, the whole, as you're coming into thinking about who's voting, you know, they're talking about sentencing and he's appealing, you know, and that type of stuff. I think that will be that's enough. So then you go, okay, what's the other 50%? And then I go, well, and then I think he's a 50-50 prospect, you know. So if that doesn't happen, I think he's a 50-50 prospect at best on the other way. So that you multiply those odds out, and it comes down to, you know, a 25% chance of getting in. So I still think it's a reasonable chance, but I think the well, and having said that, you know, we will know within the next probably 2 weeks, but it could literally be like they could have already said it as we're talking with the Supreme Court decision. Like that'll come out as to whether they're going to let it and delay it or not. And so I think that's the real critical one we need to be watching for over the next couple of weeks. And if they delay, then the odds jump quite significantly. So.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I agree with that. I think he's a lower chance than the polls would suggest. I'm just very worried about Joe Biden's brain.
Yes, that's and it doesn't even. I think there's enough narrative out there that it doesn't. You know, he will miss say things on the campaign trail without doubt.
He will.
And there is. I mean, every politician does, but now when he does, it will be within the narrative of he's going senile.
Yes.
And so, whereas, you know, arguably Trump's showing more signs of going senile relative to, but he's got the narrative. They've been very successful at painting the narrative and the false equivalences of you know, somebody took some documents home, so did he. Who cares? You know, they've been obviously using some of the you know, it's a very Russian process. Is you accuse your enemy of what you're doing yourself, but you make sure you get in first. And he's done that with the whole corruption, you know, the whole Biden corruption, corrupt, and that, you know, that actually genuinely looks like, well, as of today, the FBI is saying, you know, the person who that all came from got it from Russia, but you know, the narrative is out there, and that Bidens are corrupt, and therefore, you know, and the Trumps are corrupt as well. So who cares? It's all, you know, it's all false equivalence. So they've been very successful at it, and so it's hard to write them off, because they have, you know, the Trumps have been very good at dragging that into the mud, and people will just give up and not vote, which will play, I think, into his hands. But yeah, my expectation is no. So yeah, actually, I'd put the odds below 25%. Actually, I'd say if the Supreme Court decision comes through and does delay it, then I think the odds are 40% to 45% that he gets in. But you know, with that on, you know, if it goes the other way, I think the odds drop quite dramatically. I think you're into the 20s. You know, you need some weird surprise to come out.
If he loses, where does that leave the Republican Party? I mean, it's It was decimated.
Yeah, I don't know. You would think at some point they will need to just go through and sort of, but maybe it leads them further down the rabbit hole. I don't know. Which is obviously not good for U.S. society. But I mean, the second thing is, okay, what happens if Biden gets a second term? But there's a does it just get all ramped up to 11 now on everything? They just do the Republicans double down on the whole? We're just going to resist everything and not do anything. Quite possibly. But the flip side is, Trump's lost effectively, besides the 2016 election, which he lost a popular vote then anyway. He's lost every election since. Is it possible that with some of these court cases that the Dems end up getting both houses plus the presidency? And so that's probably as likely as Trump getting in.
It is, yes.
Is it?
I mean, that's not exactly what happened, but this so-called red wave in the midterms just never eventuated at all.
Yeah.
And so we may end up with the same, where there's pundits calling for this red wave that just doesn't exist.
Yeah, well, and that's to the point where you're like, well, what, maybe we've gone on for long enough on this one, but maybe there's a topic for another one. Is what would happen if Biden got both houses and in, or Gavin Newsom gets it? What does that mean for the US economy? So,
oh God, maybe we should do that next week.
Yeah,
because I mean that's not unrealistic.
No,
I mean the Republicans really are rolling the dice, I guess is what we're saying. This is sort of asymmetric outcomes.
Yeah, that's right, very much so. And it's a I would say they're betting on a few things to break their way, and maybe a couple of scandals at the right time, or at least they're probably preparing them. I guess even if it's just the illusion of scandals is enough that throw enough mud that whatever it is. So yeah. Okay. Well, good topic for. Let's talk more about that next week.
Alrighty. So
with that, for more content from Nucleus, you can, we've got a number of different ways you can get that. nucleuswealth.com/content. If you've got any thoughts for suggestions for the show, this actually came from Johan from last week. Thanks, Johan, for the suggestion for the topic. It was a good one and timely. So yeah, jump on and leave us some comments. We're on a bunch of different social media, as well as all major and minor podcast platforms, plus obviously on YouTube. We're live on Thursdays at 12:30. If anyone does want to jump on and ask questions, thanks for everyone who did, and we will see everyone next week.